Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are in Book 4, entitled The Course of Nations, and we are in Section 13. Chapter 1 is entitled Other Proofs Taken from Mixed Commonwealths, that is, from the tempering of the state of a succeeding commonwealth by the government of the preceding one. And we begin with paragraph 1004. All that we have had to say in this fourth book is so much evidence to prove that in the course of the entire lifetime of nations, they follow this order through these kinds of commonwealths or civil states, and no more. They all have their roots in the first, which were the divine governments, and from this beginning all nations, by the axioms above posited, as principles of the ideal eternal history, must proceed through the sequence of human things, first becoming commonwealths of optimates, later free popular commonwealths, and finally monarchies. Hence Tacitus, though he does not see them in this order, affirms, as we pointed out in the idea of the work, that outside of these three forms of public states, ordained by the nature of peoples, the others compounded of these three by human design are more to be desired of heaven than ever to be attained by effort, and if by chance any such exist, they are not enduring. But to leave no point of doubt concerning this natural succession of political or civil states, we shall find that the succession naturally admits of mixtures, not of form with form, for such mixtures would be monsters, but of a succeeding form with the preceding government. Such mixtures are founded on the axiom above, that when men change, they retain for some time the impression of their previous customs. 1005. Hence we say that the first Gentile fathers, passing from the bestial life to the human, retained in the religious times and the state of nature under the divine governments much of the savagery and cruelty of their recent origins, so that Plato recognizes in the Cyclopes of Homer the first family fathers of the world, and that likewise in the formation of the first aristocratic commonwealths, the private sovereign powers remained intact in the hands of the family fathers, just as they had held them in the previous state of nature. And because they were intensely proud, and there was no reason for one to yield to another when all were equal, they made themselves subject to aristocratic form, to the public sovereignty of their own reigning orders. Thus, the high private dominion of each family father went to make up the superior high public dominion of the senates, just as out of the private sovereignties with which they had over their families, they composed the civil sovereignties of their orders themselves. In no other way is it possible to conceive how the cities were composed of the families. The cities must therefore have originated as aristocratic commonwealths, with a natural admixture of family sovereignties. 1006. The commonwealths remained aristocratic as long as the fathers preserved this authority of ownership within their reigning orders, and until the plebs of the heroic peoples had obtained from the fathers themselves laws extending to them the certain ownership of the fields, the right to solemn nuptials, the sovereign powers, the priesthoods, and thereby the science of the laws. But as soon as the plebs of the heroic cities became numerous and inured to war, to the alarm of the fathers, who in the oligarchic commonwealths must have been few, and with force on their side, the force of their numbers, began to enact laws without the authority of the senates, then the commonwealths changed from aristocratic to popular. For no one of them could have lived for a moment with two supreme legislative powers, without distinction of subjects, times, and territories, concerning which, during with, and within which their laws were to be enacted. Hence, the dictator Philo declared by the Publilian law that the Roman Commonwealth had already become popular by nature. In this revolution, in order that the authority of ownership might retain what it could of the form that had suffered change, it naturally became the authority of guardianship, just as the power that the fathers have over their minor children is transferred on the death of the fathers to others in the form of the authority of the guardians. In virtue of this authority, The free peoples, masters of their sovereignties, as it were reigning wards, being weak in public council, naturally allowed themselves to be governed by their guardians, the senates. Thus they were by nature free commonwealths, governed aristocratically. But when the powerful in the popular commonwealths directed this public council to the private interest of their power, and free peoples, for the sake of private utilities, let themselves be seduced by the powerful to subject their public liberty to the ambition of the latter, then factions, seditions, and civil wars, ruinous to their very nations, brought on the monarchical form. Chapter 2. An eternal natural royal law by which the nations come to rest under monarchies. 1007. The monarchical form was introduced in accordance with this eternal natural royal law, felt by all the nations which recognize in Augustus the founder of the Roman monarchy. This law has escaped the notice of the interpreters of Roman law, preoccupied as they have been with the fable of the quote-unquote royal law of Tribonian, of which he openly professes himself the author in the Institutes, but which he attributes to Ulpian at one point in the Pandects. Yet it was well understood by the Roman jurisconsults, who were well acquainted with the natural law of nations. For Pomponius, in his brief history of Roman law, discussing the royal law of which we speak, described it for us in the well-considered phrase, "Kingdoms were founded at the dictation of things themselves." 1008. This natural royal law is conceived under this natural formula of eternal utility. Since in the free commonwealths all look for their own private interests, and to the service of which they press their public arms at the risk of ruin to their nations, to preserve the latter from destruction, a single man must arise, as Augustus did at Rome, and take all public concerns by force of arms into his own hands, leaving his subjects free to look after their private affairs, and after just so much public business, and of just such kinds as the monarch may entrust to them. Thus are the people saved when they would otherwise rush to their own destruction. In this truth the professors of modern law concur when they say, corporations are treated as private persons under the king, because the majority of the citizens no longer concern themselves with the public welfare. Tacitus, most learned in the natural law of nations, points out as much in his Annals, within the family of the Caesars itself, by this order of human civil ideas. As death of Augustus became imminent, a few spoke in vain of the blessings of liberty. As soon as Tiberius came, all looked to the commands of the emperor. Under the three subsequent Caesars, first came incuria, or indifference, and finally ignorance of the republic as if it were another's, ignorance of public affairs as something foreign. Thus, as the citizens have become aliens in their own nations, it becomes necessary for the monarchs to sustain and represent the latter in their own persons. Now, in free commonwealths, if a powerful man is to become monarch, the people must take his side, and for that reason monarchies are by nature popularly governed. First, through the laws by which the monarchs seek to make their subjects all equal. Then by that property of monarchies whereby sovereigns humble the powerful, and thus keep the masses safe and free from their oppressions. Further, by that property of keeping the multitude satisfied and content as regards the necessaries of life and the enjoyment of natural liberty. And finally, by the privileges conceded by monarchs to entire classes, called privileges of liberty, or to particular persons by awarding extraordinary civil honors to men of exceptional merit, these being singular laws dictated by natural equity. Hence, monarchy is the form of government best adapted to human nature when reason is fully developed, as we have said before. Chapter 3. Refutation of the principles of political theory as represented by the system of Jean Bodin. 1009. In the light of what has been set forth up to this point, we can see how much scientific foundation there is for the political theory of Jean Bodin, which places the successive forms of civil states in this order. They were first monarchic, then, having passed through a stage of tyranny, became free and popular, and finally became aristocratic. We might here content ourselves with having refuted him completely by the natural succession of political forms, which we have established by such numberless proofs, in particular in this fourth book. But it pleases us to add ad exuberantiam a refutation based on the impossibilities and absurdities of his own position. 1010. He certainly admits the truth that the families were the elements which the cities were composed. However, by a common error which we have corrected above, he has assumed that the families included only the children. How, we ask him, could monarchies have developed from such families? 1011. There are two possible ways, by force or by fraud. 1012. But how could one family father subdue the rest by force? For if in the free commonwealths, which, according to Bodine, came after the tyrannies, the family fathers consecrated themselves and their families to the fatherlands, by which their families were preserved to them, and according to him, these fathers had already been tamed under the monarchies, must we not suppose that the family fathers, when they were still cyclopes that recently emerged from their savage bestial liberty, would have allowed themselves to be slain along with their entire families rather than endure inequality? 1013. By fraud, then? This is used by those aiming at rule in the free commonwealths, offer to those whom they would seduce either liberty, or power, or wealth. But as for liberty, in the family state the fathers were all sovereigns. Power? But the nature of the Cyclopes was to live apart in their caves, and take care of their own families, with no concern for those of others, in accordance with the habits of their savage origin. And wealth, in those simple and frugal first times, had no meaning at all. 1014. The difficulty grows out of all proportion when we add that in the first barbarian times there were no fortresses, and the heroic cities made up of families were for a long time unwalled, as we learned above from Thucydides. And in the midst of the jealousies of state, which were all-consuming in the heroic aristocracies as above described, Valerius Publicola, suspected of plotting tyranny because he had built a house on high ground, in order to justify himself, had it dismantled in one night, and the next day, calling a public assembly, at his lictors lay the consular fasces at the feet of the people. The custom of leaving cities unwalled lasted longest among the most savage nations. Thus we read that Henry the Fowler was the first in Germany to bring in the people from the villages, in which they had previously been dispersed, to dwell in cities and to gird them with walls. So much for the notion that the first founders of the cities were those who marked out with the plough the walls and the gates, the name porta for gate being derived, according to the Latin etymologists, from their lifting and carrying the plough a portando eratro, over the places where they wanted the gates to be. Thus, between the savagery of the barbarous times and the insecurity of the palaces at the court of Spain, more than 80 persons of royal blood were slain within 60 years, so that the fathers of the Illiberetan Council, one of the earliest of the Latin Church, condemned this frequently recurring wickedness under penalty of solemn excommunication. 1015. But the difficulty mounts to infinity if we assume the families to include only the children, for in that case, whether by force or by fraud, the children must have been the instruments of the ambitions of others, and have betrayed and slain their own fathers. Thus the first states would not have been monarchies, but impious and wicked tyrannies. But when the young nobles, because of their hatred for the severity of the laws which is characteristic of aristocratic commonwealths, as benign laws are of popular commonwealths, clement ones of legitimate kingdoms, and dissolute ones of tyrannies, a severity of which these young conspirators made trial at the cost of their lives, the 2 sons of Brutus, numbered among the conspirators, were beheaded, their own father dictating the severe penalty. Thus we may see how monarchic the Roman commonwealth was, and how popular the liberty established therein by Brutus. 1016. In face of such and so many difficulties, Bodine, and with him all other political writers, ought to recognize the family monarchies and the state of the families as here shown, and to admit that the families included not only children, but famuli, after whom they were called families in the first place. We have seen that these famuli foreshadowed the slaves who appeared after the founding of cities as a result of their wars. In this way, free men and slaves are the matter of commonwealths, as Bodine will have it, though they cannot be so on his premises. 1017. Because of this difficulty on Bodine's premises of making free men and slaves the matter of commonwealths, he himself is surprised that his own people should have been called Franks or freemen, when, as he observes in their earliest times, they were treated as base-born slaves. This is because, from his position, he could not see that the nations were brought to completion by those who were freed from bondage by Ptolemaean law. Thus the Franks, the source of Bodine's surprise, are the same as the rustic vassals whom Hauptmann is surprised to find called homines or men, and of whom, as we have shown in this work, the plebs of the first heroic peoples were composed. It was these masses, as we have also shown, that moved the aristocracies to popular liberty, and finally to monarchy, and did so in virtue of the vulgar tongue in which, under these last two forms of government, the laws are conceived, as explained above. On this tongue of house-born slaves, for such a house-born slave, and not one taken in war, is what is meant by verna. And we have shown above that these house-born slaves existed among all ancient nations from the time of the family state. For this same reason the Greeks ceased to be called Achaeans, whence the Homeric phrase for the heroes, sons of the Achaeans, and took the name Hellenes from Hellen, who started the Greek vulgar tongue, just as the sons of Israel dropped that name of their earliest times, and took on that of the Hebrew people from Heber, whom the fathers declared to have been propagator of the sacred tongue. So well did Bodine and all the other writers on political theory see this most luminous truth, which has been clearly demonstrated throughout this entire work, with particular reference to Roman history, namely that the plebs of the peoples, always and in all nations, have changed states from aristocratic to popular, and from popular to monarchic, and that by founding the vulgar languages, as fully proved above in the Origin of Languages, they gave their names to the nations, as we have just seen. It was in this way that the ancient Franks, to the surprise of Bodine, gave their name to France. 1018. Finally, to apply the test of present experience, the aristocratic states are very few, and are survivals from barbarian times. Venice, Genoa, and Lucca in Italy, Ragusa and Dalmatia in Nuremberg in Germany. The others are popular states governed aristocratically. Wherefore Bodine, whose theory obliges him to hold that the Roman kingdom was monarchic, and that the expulsion of the tyrants was followed by the introduction of popular liberty at Rome, fails to find in the first period of Roman freedom the effects called for by his principles, because the actual effects were those proper to an aristocratic commonwealth, and in order to come credibly out of it, as we observed above, says at first that the Roman state was popular, but its government was aristocratic, and then, constrained by the force of the truth, confesses in another passage with crass inconsistency that the state as well as the government was aristocratic. 1019. Such errors in political theory spring from a failure to define the three terms people, kingdom, and liberty, as we have noted several times already. Thus, it has been believed that the first peoples were composed of plebeian as well as noble citizens, whereas we have shown by 1,000 proofs that only the nobles were included. The liberty of ancient Rome has been thought to be popular liberty, meaning the freedom of the people from the nobles, whereas we have found it to be aristocratic liberty, that is, freedom of the nobles from the tyrant Tarquins, and statues were erected to the slayers of such tyrants because they had acted by order of the reigning senates. The kings and the savagery of the first peoples and the insecurity of the palaces were aristocratic, such as the 2 life-term kings at Sparta, an aristocratic commonwealth beyond doubt, as we have shown, and later the 2 annual consuls at Rome, whom Cicero calls annual kings in his laws. This institution, due to Junius Brutus, as Livy plainly declares, entailed no change in the Roman kingdom so far as the royal power was concerned. And we have already observed that there was appeal to the people from these annual kings during their reign, and that when their reign expired, they had to render an accounting of their administration to the people. And we remark too that in heroic times it was a daily occurrence for one king to drive another from the throne, as Thucydides said. And we noted in this the resemblance to the returned barbarian times, in which we read of nothing more uncertain and variable than the fortune of the kingdoms. We pondered the opening words of the Annals of Tacitus, who often conveys his views by the propriety and force of the words he chooses. Quote, "The city of Rome in the beginning was held by kings." End quote. This is the weakest of the 3 degrees of possession distinguished by the jurisconsults, for which the verbs haber, tenere, and possedere, and he uses the word urbum, which means, strictly speaking, the buildings, in order to signify a physical possession, and not civitatem, which is the community of the citizens, all or the majority of whom make up spiritually the public constitution. Section 14. Final Proofs to Confirm the Course of Nations. Chapter 1. Punishments, Wars, Order of Numbers. 1020. There are other instances of the congruity of effects with the causes assigned to them in the principles of this science, which confirm the natural course of the lives of nations. We have already mentioned most of them in scattered passages without any order. Here we shall bring them together and arrange them according to the natural succession of human things. 1021. Punishments, for example, in the time of the families, were of a cyclopean cruelty. It is in this state that Marsyas is flayed by Apollo. They continued so in the aristocratic commonwealths. Thus the shield of Perseus turned its beholders to stone, as explained above. Punishments were called paradigmata by the Greeks in the same sense in which the Latins called them exempla, that is, exemplary chastisements. And as we have also observed before, in the returned barbarian times, punishments by death were called ordinary punishments. So the laws of Sparta, a commonwealth we have shown by 1,000 proofs to be aristocratic, which were judged savage and cruel by Plato and Aristotle alike, required that the illustrious king Agis should be strangled to death. And the laws of Rome, while it was an aristocratic state, condemned the noble and victorious Horatius to be stripped, beaten with rods, and hanged to an unhappy tree. We have spoken of both these incidents above in another connection. Under the law of the 12 tables, those who had set fire to another's grain were condemned to be burned alive. False witnesses were cast from the Tarpeian rock, and defaulting debtors were torn to pieces while still alive. This last-named punishment, Tullus Hostilius did not spare his peer Medius Fufidius, king of Alba, because he had failed to keep his pledge of alliance, and Romulus himself before that time had been torn to pieces by the fathers on a mere suspicion of treason to the state. Let this suffice for those who contend that such punishments were never dealt out in Rome. 1022. Later came the mild punishments, practiced in the popular commonwealths, commanded by the multitude, which, being made up of the weak, is naturally inclined to compassion. Thus the Roman people, more from admiration of his valor than from the justice of his cause, more out of admiration for virtue than for the right of the cause, in the elegant phrase of Livy already cited above, absolved Horatius when he was condemned for killing his sister in the heroic rage at seeing her weeping over the public good fortune. And just as Plato and Aristotle in the times of Athenian freedom censured the Spartan laws, as we noted a little while ago, so in the mildness of Roman popular liberty, Cicero protests against the inhuman cruelty of the death penalty, in the case of a private Roman knight, Rabirius, who had been found guilty of treason. Finally came the monarchies in which princes rejoiced to receive the grateful title Clement. 1023. Again, the barbaric wars of the heroic times meant the ruin of conquered cities, and the surrendered foes became herds of laborers scattered over the countryside to cultivate the fields of the victors. Such as we explained above were the heroic inland colonies. The magnanimity of the popular commonwealths, as long as they were ruled by their senates, took from the vanquished the law of the heroic nations, but left them in free enjoyment of the natural law of human nations of which Ulpian speaks. As conquests were extended, all the rights later were called propria civium Romanorum, were restricted to Roman citizens. These rights, such as solemn nuptials, paternal power, sui heredis, agnates, Gentiles, queritary or civil ownership, emancipation, usucapion, stipulation, testaments, guardianship, and inheritance, must all have been possessed as civil law rights of their own by the subject nations when they were still free. Finally came the monarchies, which seek, as under Antoninus Pius, i.e. Caracalla, to make one Rome of all the Roman world. For it is a vow characteristic of great monarchs to make one city of the whole world, as Alexander the Great used to say that for him all the world was a single city, of which his phalanx was the citadel. Thus the natural law of nations developed in the provinces by the Roman praetors came home at long last to dictate laws in the Romans' own house. The heroic law which the Romans had exercised over the provinces was relinquished, because monarchs desire all their subjects to be made equal by their laws. And Roman jurisprudence, which in heroic times had been based entirely on the law of the 12 Tables, and which in the times of Cicero, as he notes in his laws, had begun to follow the edict of the Roman praetor, finally from the days of the Emperor Hadrian on down, concerned itself entirely with the Edictum Perpetuum, as perpetual edict, composed and arranged by Salvius Julianus, almost wholly from the provincial edicts. 1024. Again, from the little districts which could well be governed by the aristocratic commonwealths, through expansion by the conquest to which the free commonwealths were disposed, we finally arrive at monarchies, which are beautiful and magnificent in proportion as they are big. 1025. From the brooding suspicions of aristocracies, through the turbulence of popular commonwealths, nations come at last to rest under monarchies. 1026. But lastly, we wish to show how on this concrete and composite order of human civil things we may superimpose the order of numbers, which are the purest abstracts. Governments began with the one in the family monarchies, passed to the few in the heroic aristocracies, went on to the many and all the politic, and finally in civil monarchies returned again to the one. By the nature of numbers, we cannot conceive a more adequate division or another order than one, few, many, and all, with the few, many, and all retaining, each in its kind, the principle of the one, just as numbers consist of indivisibles according to Aristotle, and when we have passed the all, we must begin again with the one. And thus the history of humanity is all contained between the family monarchies and the civil monarchies. Chapter 2. Corollary. That the ancient Roman law was a serious poem, and the ancient jurisprudence a severe kind of poetry, within which are found the first outlines of legal metaphysics in the rough, and how, among the Greeks, philosophy was born of the laws. 1027. There are many other great effects, in particular in Roman jurisprudence, which find their causes only in these same principles. Above all, by the axiom that as men are naturally drawn to the pursuit of the true, the desire of it, when they cannot attain it, causes them to cling to the certain. Emancipations began vera manu, with the actual hand, that is the real force, since force is abstract and hand is concrete. Among all nations the hand signified power, hence hand-placings and hand-raisings of the Greeks. In the former, those elected to power had bestowed upon them by the laying of hands on their heads. In the latter, powers already bestowed were acclaimed by the raising of hands. Such ceremonial gestures are proper to mute times. The elections of kings in returned barbarian times was likewise acclaimed. Such actual emancipation occurs in the case of occupation, the first great natural source of all property rights, of which occupatio bellica was a survival among the Romans. Hence slaves were called mancipia, and the booty and the conquest res mancipi, of the Romans having become by the victory res nec mancipi in relation to the vanquished. So true it is that emancipation began within the walls of the single city of Rome as a way of acquiring civil ownership in private transactions between Romans. 1028. This actual emancipation was accompanied by a correspondingly actual usucapion, that is, acquisition of ownership, for such is the meaning of capio, by actual use, in the sense of which usus signifies possessio. Possession was originally exercised by continuous physical tenure of the thing possessed. Possessio must have come from porosessio, as domiciles were called sedes in Latin, from this continual act of sitting or standing firm, and not from pedum positio, as the Latin etymologists say, for the praetor assists the former, and not the latter, kind of possession, and upholds it by interdicts. From this position, called thesis by the Greeks, Theseus must have taken his name, and not from his handsome posture, as the Greek etymologists say, for the men of Attica founded Athens by remaining fixed there a long time. This is the usucapion which legitimizes states among all nations. 1029. Further, in Aristotle's heroic commonwealths, which had no laws for redress of private wrongs, were carried out with real force. Such were the first duels of private wars of the world, and conductiones were private reprisals, which in the returned barbarism lasted down to the times of Bartolus. 1030. As the savagery of the times began to abate, as private violence began to be forbidden by judiciary laws, and all private forces were becoming united in the public force called civil sovereignty, the first peoples, by nature poets, must naturally have imitated the real forces that they had previously employed to preserve their rights and institutions. And so they made a fable of natural emancipation, and created from it solemn civil conveyance, represented by the handing over of a symbolic knot, in imitation of the chain whereby Jove had bound the giants to the first unoccupied lands, and by which they themselves had later bound thereto their clients or famuli. With this symbolic emancipation, they consecrated all their civil transactions by actus legitimi, which must have been solemn ceremonies of peoples still mute. Later, articulate speech having meanwhile been formed, in order to make certain of one another's wills and contracts, they determined that agreements, at the moments of handing over this knot, should be clothed with solemn words, in which certain and precise stipulations were conceived. Thus later in war they conceived the terms under which they accepted the surrender of vanquished cities. These were called peaces, from passio, which means the same as pactum. A notable survival of this remains in the formula for the surrender of Calatia. In Livy's account, it is a contract of receiving under one's power, in the form of solemn questions and answers. Hence it was with full propriety that those who had surrendered were called recepti, as the Roman herald said to the representatives of Calatia, et ego recipio. So much for the notion that in heroic times stipulation was restricted to Roman citizens, and so much for the discernment of those who have hitherto believed that Tarquinius Priscus, in the formula of the surrender of Calatia, meant to teach the nations how surrenders were to be conducted. 1031. In this way, the law of the heroic nation of Latium remained fixed in the famous article of the Law of the 12 Tables, which reads, quote, "If one executes a bond or conveyance, as his tongue has declared, so let it be binding." End quote. This is the great fount of all ancient Roman law, which those who compare it with Attic law confess did not come from Athens to Rome. 1032. Usucapion at first extended only as far as physical possession. Later this was feigned, and the intent to possess sufficed. In the same way, they symbolized vindications by a feigned force, and heroic reprisals were transformed into personal actions, preserving the solemnity of denunciation of debtors. The childhood of the world could have followed no other path, for children, as we have set forth in an axiom, have a powerful faculty for imitating the truth in matters within their capacity, and it is in this that poetry consists, which is nothing but imitation. 1033. Thus there appears in the marketplace as many masks as there were persons, for persona properly means simply a mask, or as there were names. The names which in the times of mute speech took the form of real words must have been the family coat of arms, by which families were found to be distinguished among the American Indians, as above said. And under the person or mask of the father of a family were concealed all his children and servants, and under the real name or emblem of a house were concealed all its agnates and Gentiles. Thus we saw Ajax, the tower of the Greeks, and Horatius alone on the bridge, withstanding the whole of Tuscany. And in the returned barbarian times we encountered 40 Norman heroes, driving an entire army of Saracens from Salerno. Hence the reputation for amazing strength of the paladins of France, who were sovereign princes, and whose names survived in the Counts of Palatine of Germany, and above all of Count Roland, later called Orlando. The reason for this springs from the principles of poetry discovered above. The founders of Roman law, at a time when they could not understand intelligible universals, fashioned imaginative universals. And just as the poets later by art brought personages and masks onto the stage, so these men by nature had previously brought the aforesaid names and persons into the forum. 1034. The word persona must have not been derived from personare, to resound everywhere, for it was not necessary in the quite small theatres of the first cities, when, as Horace says, the spectators were so few as to be easily counted, to use masks for resonance to enable the voice to fill a large theatre. And besides, the quantity of the second syllable does not admit of this derivation, for if it came from sono, it would have to be short. It must rather have come from personari, a verb which we conjecture meant to wear the skins of wild beasts, which was permitted only to heroes. The companion verb, opsonari, has come down to us. It must at first have meant to feed on the meat of hunted game, which must have been the first rich fare on which Virgil describes his heroes as feasting. Hence the first rich spoils must have been the skins of these slain beasts, brought back by the heroes from their first wars, which were waged against the beasts in defense of themselves and their families as set forth above. The poets clothe their heroes in these pelts, and above all Hercules, who wears that of the lion. To such an origin of the verb personari, in the primary meaning which we have restored it, is to be traced, we conjecture, the Italian application of the term personaggi, personages, to men of high station and great representations. 1035. On these same principles, because they did not understand abstract forms, they imagined corporeal forms, and they imagined them after their own nature as animate. Hereditas, or inheritance, they imagined as mistress of hereditary property, and they recognized her as entire in every particular item of inherited goods, just as when they presented to the judge a lump or clod from a farm, they called it hunc fundum, in the formula of re vindicatio. Thus, if they did not understand, they at least sensed in a rough way that rights were indivisible. 1036. In conformity with such natures, ancient jurisprudence was throughout poetic. By its fictions, what had happened was taken as not having happened, and what had not happened as having happened. Those not yet born as already born, the living as dead, and the dead as still living in their estates, pending acceptance. It introduced so many empty masks without subjects, rights invented by imagination. It rested its entire reputation on inventing such fables as might preserve the gravity of the laws and do justice to the facts. Thus all the fictions of ancient jurisprudence were truths under masks, and the formulae in which the laws were expressed, because of their strict measures of such and so many words, admitting neither addition, subtraction, nor alteration, were called carmina, or songs, as above we found Livy terming the formula dictating the punishment of Horatius. This is confirmed by a golden passage in the Asinaria of Plautus, where Diabolus says that the parasite is a great poet, for he knows better than anybody how to invent verbal safeguards or formulae, which we have just seen were called carmina. 1037. Thus all ancient Roman law was a serious poem, represented by the Romans in the Forum, and ancient jurisprudence was a severe poetry. Very conveniently to our argument, Justinian, in the Promium of the Institutes, speaks of the fables of the ancient law, antiqui iuris fabulas. He uses the phrase in derision, but he must have taken it from some ancient jurisconsult who had understood the matters we have been discussing. From these ancient fables, as we here prove, Roman jurisprudence drew its principles, and from the masks called personae, which were used in these dramatic fables, so true and severe, derived the first origins of the doctrine of the law of persons, de iure personarum. 1038. With the coming of the human times of the popular commonwealths, the intellect was brought into play in the great assemblies, and universal legal concepts abstracted by the intellect were thenceforward said to have their being in the understanding of the law. This understanding is concerned with the intention which the lawmaker has expressed in his law, this intention being called ius, an intention which was that of the citizens brought into agreement upon an idea of common rational utility. This they must have understood as spiritual in nature, because all those rights which did not attach to corporeal things over which they could be exercised, and which were called nuda iura, rights not corporeally vested, were said in intellectu iuris consitere. Since rights are thus modes of spiritual substance, they are therefore indivisible, and hence also eternal, for corruption is nothing else than division of parts. 1039. The interpreters of Roman law have rested the entire reputation of legal metaphysics on the consideration of the indivisibility of rights in their treatment of the famous subject of divisibles and indivisibles. But they have not considered the other and no less important attribute of eternity. Yet they should have noted in the following two rules of law. The first establishes that cessante fine legis cessat lex. It does not read cessante ratione, for the finis, or end of the law, is the equal utility of causes, which may fail of realization. But the ratio, or reason of the law, is a conformity of the law to the fact, clothed in such and such circumstances, and whenever the fact is so clothed, the reason of the law lives and governs it. The other rule establishes that time is not the way to establish or dissolve law, for time cannot give a beginning or put an end to the eternal. And in usucapion and prescription time neither produces nor terminates the rights, but is proof that he who held them intended to relinquish them. From the fact that the usufruct, for example, is said to terminate, it does not follow that the right terminates, but only that it is detached from the servitude and becomes free as before. Herefrom spring two very important corollaries. First, that as rights are eternal in the intelligence of them or in their idea, whereas men have their being in time, the rights can come to men only from God. And second, that all the countless various rights that have been, now or are ever will be in the world, are diverse modifications of the power of the first man, who was the prince of the human race, and of the ownership which he held over the whole earth. 1040. Now, because the law certainly came first and philosophies later, it must have been from observing that the enactment of laws by the Athenian citizens involved their coming to agreement in an idea of an equal utility common to all them severally, that Socrates began to adumbrate intelligible genera or abstract universals by induction, that is, by collecting uniform particulars which go to make up a genus, of that in respect of which the particulars are uniform among themselves. 1041. Plato, reflecting that in such public assemblies the minds of particular men, each passionately bent on his private utility, are brought together in a dispassionate idea of common utility, according to the saying that men individually are swayed by their private interests, but collectively they seek justice, raised himself to the meditation of the highest intelligible ideas of created minds, ideas which are distinct from these created minds, and can reside only in God. And thus he reached the height of conceiving the philosophical hero who commands his passions at will. 1042. The way was thus prepared for the divine definition which Aristotle later gave us of a good law as a free will of passion, which is to say the will of a hero. He understood justice as queen of the virtues, seated in the spirit of the hero and commanding all the others. For he had observed legal justice seated in the spirit of the sovereign civil power, and dictating prudence in the Senate, fortitude in the armies, and temperance at festivals, as well as the two forms of particular justice, distributive justice in the public treasuries, and communicative justice for the most part in the forum, the latter employing arithmetic proportion, and the former geometric. He must have observed distributive justice in the census, which is the basis of the popular commonwealths, and which distributes honors and burdens in geometric proportion, according to the patrimonies of the citizens. For previously only arithmetic proportion had been understood. Wherefore Aristrea, heroic justice, was depicted for us with the scales. And in the law of the 12 tables, all the punishments, which philosophers, moral theologians, and professors writing on public law now say must be dispensed by distributive justice and geometric proportion, all the punishments, which philosophers, moral theologians, and professors writing on public law now say must be dispensed by distributive justice and geometric proportion, all the punishments we read reduce either to the double, duplio, if pecuniary, and to the like, talio, if corporeal. And since the law of retaliation was invented by Rhadamanthus, he was made judge in the lower world, in which punishments are certainly distributed. In Aristotle's Ethics, retaliation was called Pythagorean justice, invented by Pythagoras, whom we have revealed as founder of a nation in Magna Graecia, whose nobles were called Pythagoreans, as above noted. This invention would be a disgrace to the Pythagoras who later became a sublime philosopher and mathematician. 1043. From all the above, we conclude that these principles of metaphysics, logic, and morals issued from the marketplace of Athens, from Solon's advice to the Athenians, know thyself, as set forth above in one of the corollaries of our poetic logic, came forth the popular commonwealths, from the popular commonwealths the laws, and from the laws emerged philosophy. And Solon, who had been wise in vulgar wisdom, came to be held wise in esoteric wisdom. This may serve as a fragment of the history of philosophy told philosophically, and a last reproof of the many brought forth in this work against Polybius, who said that if there were philosophers in the world, there would be no need of religions. For the fact is that if there had not been religions, and hence commonwealths, there would have been no philosophers in the world. And if human affairs had not been thus guided by divine providence, there would have been no idea of either science or virtue. 1044. Now, to return to our subject and conclude the argument under discussion, in these human times in which the popular commonwealths and afterwards the monarchies appeared, it was understood that the causes of legal obligation, which had at first been formulae safeguarded by precise and proper words, for cavere is the origin of cavese, of which causse is the shortened form, were the affairs or transactions themselves in the case of consensual contracts, which affairs or transactions are now solemnized by pacts, which in the act of contract are agreed upon so that they will produce the actions. In the case of those contracts which are valid titles for the conveyance of property, they solemnize the natural delivery in order to effect the transfer. And only in the contracts which are said to be completed by word of mouth, that is to say, in stipulations, did the verbal safeguards remain causes in the strict ancient sense. What we have said here illustrates further the principles above set forth for the obligations arising from contracts and pacts. 1045. To sum up, a man is properly only mind, body, and speech speech stands as it were midway between mind and body. Hence the certitude of law began in mute times with the body. Then when the so-called articulate languages were invented, it passed to certain ideas or verbal formulae. And finally, when our human reason was fully developed, it reached its end in the truth of ideas concerning justice, determined by reason from the detailed circumstances of the facts. This is a formula devoid of any particular form, called by the learned Varro formula naturae, which, like light, of itself informs in all the minutest details of their surface the opaque bodies of the facts over which it is diffused, as we have fully indicated in the Elements. This is the end of Book 4, from The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will proceed to Book 5, entitled The Recurrence of Human Things and the Resurgence of the Nations. Thank you for listening.